One. Hey, welcome. This is Bridges live with Dr. Paul Dyer. I just want to say thank you for everyone who is listening and sharing and liking and doing all what they do on social media, and I appreciate that. But more importantly, I always like to highlight my guests. You guys know that about me, so let's get right into our guests because you can always find stuff about me, but let's find something about Dr. Constantine. Please introduce yourself, and then we'll get right into our conversation.
Sure. So I am Dr. Constance Scharff. I am an internationally recognized speaker and best-selling and award-winning author. I write about complementary mental health practices, so things that you can do in addition to
Right.
traditional talk therapies. And I write novels now. So I do both fiction and nonfiction.
Oh, I'm a nonfiction writer. I'm such a scientific writer when it comes to things of writing, and I think that's just the way my brain works.
I like both. I like both. I like fiction because it allows me to explore
Yeah,
ideas without having to be bound by, I'm a PhD, and so uh,
right.
I'm very specific about, what are the citations and what were the studies about, and so fiction allows me to explore his ideas in a way that nonfiction doesn't. Now, what I love about nonfiction, I don't write for academic journals at all anymore. I did at the very beginning of my career. But now I put everything into popular press fiction or nonfiction, excuse me, because it gives people direct access
Yes.
to those resources and doesn't just keep it away so it's a sort of aloof conversation among academics.
I so agree with you because I do both because people have asked me, but I do so much non-academic stuff because when it comes to and I just got this wave from one of my kids going, Dad, you write love stories. And I know I write love stories because I'm a hopeless romantic, but I've never really published love stories. So that's why it's different. So I write love stories, but I've never really published love stories. So the only thing I've
Do it.
published was I know.
Do it. I have a novel coming out probably towards the end of the summer. And it's my first published novel. It's called The Path to God's Promise, and it's about if God had a contemporary female Jewish prophet, what would God say to us? Right. And so it's about climate change. It's really about climate change and both the physical and the psychological impacts of that. But I was surprised about how publishers were very interested. They're like, we don't know if we can make money on this book,
Right.
but it needs to be out there. And there are so many more publishing options than there used to be.
Yes.
So I encourage you, if that's a story, if those are stories you want to share, share them because you'll have an audience for them. There are people who don't just want what the major publishing houses offer.
And I know I teach, when I write, my books have been about the science of mental health, basically
Right.
about the neuroscience, the chemistry, how it affects the body. But when you talked about writing to help people into addition to, explain that because people are still so stuck in if I'm doing this, I'm getting better. But what if I'm not getting better? Then I don't know what else to do. And I think you're filling that gap. Is that what you're doing?
I am filling that gap.
Yeah.
So there's several different things in what you're talking about. One of them is let's take a step back and talk about what works and what doesn't. And you come from a neuroscience perspective, and all of our brains work the same. It doesn't matter your culture, your race, your
Right.
age, your whatever. Age, well, because there's an aging brain, so that there's some
Yeah.
changes there. But for the most part, if you have gray matter in here, it all works the same, right? It has the same general process, just as digestion. Healthy
Right.
digestion works the same in all people. Circulation works the same in all people. And so we can set that to one side because there are certain things that are going to be the same. Alzheimer's, for example, would be the
Mm-hmm.
same across cultures. But most issues of mental health, my experience is that they have a cultural component, a biopsychosocial component.
Yeah.
And so what we believe is true, the narratives we tell ourselves, the stories we tell ourselves, what we believe is true is true. I'm not talking about truths with a capital T, like is there a
Right.
God and how is the universe
Right.
formed and all of that.
Right.
I'm talking about little t truths.
Yeah.
So if you believe, if you have been told and you believe, for example, let's take it out of the realm of mental health, that weight loss is calories in, calories out, and you are starving yourself and you are not getting the results that you believe you should be getting because
Right.
of the worldview that you hold, right? Then you're like, what is wrong with me? Because
Yep.
that's the default. What is wrong with me? What if the basic premise, the story that we've been told or accepted or told ourselves, is not in fact true?
Right. It's false.
It's false, right? We know that if you eat a bunch of carbs and sugar and you eat the same number of calories in broccoli, right, you are going to have a different result in your
Correct.
in your body. So in the realm of mental health, I've had the good fortune to travel a great deal. And I have been very lucky, especially early in my career as an undergraduate, in fact, to live in India and in Kenya and in other parts
I
of.
did live in India.
Really?
Yeah. That's where I
Oh,
did. That's why I studied my naturopathic health too. Was in India.
oh wow. Oh, so
Yeah.
I loved India. I
I love
also
you.
hated India. Like India is so overwhelming, especially if you're like a Western person. I was just like, oh, what is all this?
Yeah.
India is like nowhere else in the world. It is
No.
sight, sound,
Yeah.
smell,
Yeah.
everything inundates you all the time. It is so overwhelming.
Well, wait a minute. I'm a New Yorker, so I grew up with that.
Okay, so I come from the country. I come from rural California and Oregon. Like I
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
I actually went to St. Lawrence University in Northern New York, which I love my alma mater. But that's also a rural
Yeah.
university, like
Yeah. I'm a Bronx kid. So Bronx, Midtown, the Bowery. So sight, smell, people. I'm kind of that's what.
I
So,
was not prepared. Although the first time I went to New York City and I saw, a mouse the size of a house cat,
yes.
or not a
Yeah.
mouse, a rat the size of a
Right.
house cat, I
Yeah.
was like, no, no.
Now they have voting privileges.
Oh no, I've heard. Yeah, I've heard. So, but the thing about India is when you see someone who has what we would call a mental health problem, what we
Yeah.
would call diagnosable mental illness in the United States, schizophrenia, they hear voices, they talk to people who we don't see, whatever the case may be. In India, they're considered touched by God, not
Correct.
touched by God like you're nuts, touched by
Right.
God like you have a gift. And they're treated very differently
Mhm.
than people with the same quote unquote illness here in the United States. So you see not only very different outcomes for the person in terms of community support, but you also see very different symptom displays.
Mm-hmm.
If you treat a person like they are crazy, how are they going to behave? If you treat a person like they, should be shunned from society,
Yeah.
it amplifies those behaviors. If you treat a person like they are particularly blessed with gifts that the rest of us don't have, they display very different behaviors, even though they have the same diagnoses.
How can we spread that? Because I I agree. I agree. It's like the choir. Like we're together.
Yeah.
But I don't think the many are doing that. And I'm trying to help people learn how to do that. And it's we're doing what we do because we do what we do, but there's still so much getting missed. So how do we amplify that type of relationship we have to have with humanity? We're missing that so much.
Right, which is why I write both fiction and nonfiction, because we get to explore these ideas, right? So how do we connect to our humanness?
Yes.
And I think that we are starting to do that. My fear is that it's happening too slowly for
Mm,
us to have the major sea change that we need to have real social adjustments.
right.
I think we're starting to see it in terms of mental health with addiction.
Yes.
So my work really initially was and still is mostly at the intersection of addiction and trauma, where those two issues come to pass. But we've been losing now more than 100,000 people in the United States alone each year, for the last year or two to overdose, mostly
Yes.
because of fentanyl. That affects everybody. When you
And we don't
have
and we don't
that,
even call that a pandemic, which is so upsetting.
right, right. Well, because we still have the social viewpoint that those people are bad.
Right.
But I think that is starting to change because it's affecting so many people who are not addicts. I spent Thanksgiving of 2018 in Hawaii, and I was walking with my goddaughter is Australian, and I was walking with my goddaughter back from dinner, and there was a woman who had clearly overdosed in the sidewalk. And she was, oh, I don't know, 7 at the time, little girl.
Hmm.
And she looked at me and she was like, I want to hold her hand. And I'm like, you can't, because she can overdose just from that. I don't know. The woman was clearly breathing.
Right. Right.
I had asked, there were other people around. They said, has an ambulance been called? The answer was yes. And we could actually hear the ambulance
On its
very,
way. Yeah.
very
Yeah.
close. But to tell a child who wants to show compassion, you
Mhm.
can't touch her because then you could.
That's right. The chemistry that
It's
seeps through the body, that absorbs through the skin. I hope people recognize when you said that she couldn't. It's not because Constantine didn't want her goddaughter to be not compassionate. We got to understand there's a chemistry component
exactly.
that's
She could that
so
my that the child could overdose
overdosed. Right.
from skin to skin contact.
That's right.
And so, but because there are so many people who are, kids will go out and they'll want a Ritalin to help them study. They're not drug addicts, and they get something from, they'll get by from social media as a big way to buy those kinds of drugs. And it's not, it looks exactly like what you get at the drugstore, and it's not, and they die. And because that's happening more and more and more and more, I think people are really starting to understand that addicts aren't bad people, that there is something psychological and biochemical going on
Mm-hmm.
that they have to use.
Right.
And, I'm sober for 24 and a half years. But
Congratulations.
thank you. But when I was using, if you invited me to your wedding,
And I would.
well, I appreciate that. If you invited me to your wedding, I would have to show up drunk or get drunk. Am I going to make a fool of myself?
Mhm.
Maybe. Am I going to, fall asleep? Maybe. Am I going to throw up? Probably. That's not because I don't care about you. I'm showing up to your wedding and I'm
Right.
going to probably drink as little as I can. But the reality is I have to drink, and
Right.
and your wedding is just going to be kind of in the way of that. And I'm going to do the best I can because I care about you, but there's only so much that I can do. I had a cousin who her mother was getting married, and she was, I don't know, mid 20s at the time, very, severe heroin addict. And her mother said, I want her to be at my wedding. And during the service, she went on the nod and leaned over, sort of semi passed out, and her breast fell out of her dress. One of her breasts fell out of her dress. And everyone, of course, is horrified. And her uncle, who was sitting next to her, pushed her back, shook her boob back in her dress, and everybody went on.
Yeah.
She died not long after that. And her mother is so grateful that she had her at the wedding and didn't say, you can't come if you're high.
When it comes to trauma, because working with trauma and having that pleasure center of the brain being stamped by a memory that triggers so much its need for something. It doesn't matter what its need for. It could be this or that. Addiction's not always drugs. Most people, I hope people hear
Sure.
this and understand that. Please recognize if you hear addiction, you're thinking it's drugs or whatever, or it's not. Addiction is many things that triggers a response.
Sure. So when people ask me, well, can I be addicted to something positive? And I say, well, I mean, maybe, but addiction to me is something that you are compelled to do
Yeah.
that causes overwhelming negative consequences in your life.
Right.
And that despite wanting to stop the behavior, you cannot. You
Period.
can't stop or
Right.
control it. So if I control my drinking and I hold myself on, one occasion to
Right.
2 drinks, right? I'm absolutely miserable. I'm grouchy as can be. I mean, I'm a total B. There's no way around it. I mean, just absolutely miserable, and you don't want to be around me. But I can't do that for the long term. I tried actually before I stopped drinking. I tried to control my drinking, and I was able to go 6 days. 6 days without picking up a drink. That was the longest I could go on my own. And what people don't understand is whatever the addiction is, sugar is actually a very bad addiction. Um, but whatever the addiction is, you use that behavior or substance because the sun came up, because the sun went down, because it's Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, or any other day ending in a Y, because you are on this side of the dirt and you don't have the ability to change that. And that's why therapeutics are so important.
So self-care, can someone self-care their way out of addiction without understanding the why they are addicted?
Maybe, but I would change the idea from self-care to community connection.
I love it.
So the opposite of addiction is not sobriety. It's not abstinence from the
Right.
behavior.
Right.
It is what is curative of addiction and trauma is connection.
Yeah.
And so I've been in many communities where there really isn't addiction. I had the good fortune of spending some time with the San, the Bushmen of the Kalahari, they're
Yeah.
often called, in Namibia. There's no appreciable addiction that anyone I talked to was aware of. Them say, well, they live out and they're nomads and they live out in the bush, and no, they now when they go to town and live, in Windhoek or Cape Town
Yeah.
or wherever, well, then you start seeing addiction because you start seeing trauma.
That's right.
But in the village,
There is none.
there is none because whenever someone is not right, physically, emotionally, whatever, the whole village comes together and supports them. So with the San, they'll do some energy work. If someone's physically ill, they'll do energy work akin to Reiki. But what I was really interested in is the psychological work they do. And they sing and they clap and they and dance until the person feels better. I was in Kenya, in the very north of the country, with the Samburu, who are cousins of the Maasai,
Mhm.
and there was an old man who was clearly dying. And the village went over and sang and danced outside of the little hut that he was in. And he didn't die for like 3 or 4 more months. He literally got up off of his deathbed and he's like, I'm not going to die. And he just went on living. So that's the power of connection,
That's
right?
right.
That's the power of connection. And so, what I think Western psychology, and I am not a psychologist.
And I
People
don't
always,
want to pick on them either.
no,
So
no, but one of the mistakes that Western psychology I think has made
yeah.
is this emphasis on talk therapies,
Yes.
which have a place and are
It does.
very useful in many situations.
And I hope people get it. It's good for them. Great. It's almost like I want to put a disclaimer for people to be start throwing, rocks and papers and scissors at what we're saying, because it's all good, but it has a place.
It has a place.
Yeah.
And so, and it has a this is the thing that's interesting. It has a particular cultural context.
Yes,
And
absolutely.
so, for example, in the United States, among Native Americans, very few Native Americans go to talk therapy. And when they do, they usually go once and they
Hmm.
don't go back. It's a very, very small percentage that actually stays for more. Why? Because they're like, this doesn't make sense. Why
African
would I?
Americans the same way.
Absolutely.
I the same way.
It doesn't make sense. Whereas in, I think it was Zimbabwe. It could have been Zambia, but I think it was Zimbabwe. Uh, a guy saw that they didn't have the number of psychologists and psychiatrists necessary for the amount of depression that they were seeing. Because keep in mind, a whole generation was virtually wiped out by AIDS in that part of Africa.
Mhm.
So there's tremendous depression, and there's no service providers. And so, in the Western sense, in the Eurocentric Western sense,
Okay.
and so he said, well, there's lots of old people. And so he
Yeah.
literally got some funding, put park benches out
For old people to sit.
for old people to sit, and then people came up and talked to them.
That's right.
And the old
Connection.
people, yeah, and the old people got a little bit of training, like, these people are going to be depressed, and, here's some things that you can do for them. But, you know, how much training does an 85-year-old, great grandma need in terms of talking someone in her community through it to see something from a more positive perspective? And so there is so much cultural knowledge
Hmm.
that is lost
Lost. And
to
do you
this
think
hyper
do
focus.
you think it's lost or specifically being removed? Because some black parts of the black community say it's specifically taken out for the Eurocentric idealism.
I think I think both are true. I
Hmm.
think both are true. I think that the Black community would certainly be better able to speak to it than I could, because I'm an outsider looking in.
Right.
What I can say is, the other part of the question that you asked initially is
Hmm.
I think our perspectives and our stories do us a disservice in
Hmm.
the way we other people who are
Right.
different, right? So
Right.
people look at me and they see a white lady. I'm Jewish, so I know really about being other and,
Yeah.
disliked and mistrusted and so forth. But I also, even though your insert any other group
Right.
that's not
Right.
exactly like me, um experience is different than mine, I have compassion, human compassion, for injustice. So let me give two examples. One,
Well,
when George,
to
go
be
ahead.
a mensch, most people don't understand the Jewish culture historically. To be a mensch is to fight against injustice.
Yeah, and there are a lot of biblical reasons for that.
Right.
It goes back to the Passover Seder. We were,
Yeah.
slaves and sojourners in the land of Egypt, and therefore it is our responsibility, very specifically,
Yes.
to take in, whomever, and to be of
Mhm.
service, and so forth. But we also really need to talk about and be cognizant of compassion, and there are two things that are, like you're saying, historically, when Abraham Heschel walked with Martin Luther King. That was before
Mhm.
my time, right? I wasn't born then. But that to me is an example of, we must, whether it's Jewish and Black or whomever,
Right.
we must stand together. So more recently, when George Floyd is crying out for his mother as he's
Mhm.
being murdered,
Mhm.
I don't think you have to be Black
Right.
to see the injustice of that, right?
Right.
And of course, we had, a huge conflagration of people of all races, because that is a human response,
Absolutely.
you know. The other thing is right now I live in the Pacific Northwest. I live right at the border crossing to Vancouver, British Columbia. And up here there were a very large number of Indigenous First Nation Native peoples day schools. So when you talk about taking the, cultural component, I mean, that was the purpose of these, right? Take the
Right.
Indian out of the Indian.
That's right.
And I think it was 2 years ago when they uncovered hundreds of bodies
Hmm.
of children buried in mass graves, essentially. Right, just right across, I mean, right across the border here. I don't know how you can hear about that and not have the human compassion sparked in you. That is where healing comes from. Because someone who's terribly addicted to whatever, who
Right.
is terribly traumatized, that human compassion will not be sparked because it's drowned out by that behavior.
And it's a disconnect, and that's
It
what
is a
comes
total
back.
disconnect,
Yeah.
right? In trauma, we call it dissociation,
Right.
right? That I'm here and I'm talking to you, but I'm really not here, right? My consciousness really might actually be way back here, sort of. Okay, you know, and where I see that so much is with hoarding. Now,
Mm,
hoarding is really considered, an obsessive compulsive disorder, and I'm like, ugh,
right.
I don't know why that isn't addiction, right? People who go out compulsively
Have
and
to.
pick up whatever it is, cats or garbage or thrift store finds, or it doesn't make any difference,
Right.
and bring it back into a home that has no space for it,
Right.
right? I'm like, sort of looks like addiction to me. But that, I mean, when you talk to those people, right? Nobody home.
Hmm.
You think of it with chemical addictions because there's a biochemical thing that's going on there that's
Right.
nobody's home. But that a very similar process is going on with sex addiction or hoarding or whatever, because your brain, as you well know, produces
Yeah.
its own chemicals
Yeah.
that will fade you out.
It's a protective mechanisms that
Absolutely.
the body has. How can people, before we get too long, how can people get a hold of you? Because I don't want to. We could talk for a long time,
Sure, sure.
and I know attention spans are very small. So I am picking on you audiences who have a hard time listening to long conversations. So I want to be like, great, I want to hear Constantine and Paul talk more. So I want to tantalize you and say, welcome, we'll be back again. So, but when people want to get a hold of you and see things and read your books,
So I'm
please.
on all the social medias. My books are
All
for
right,
sale on Amazon,
all right.
and constancescharf.com is where you find me online. But literally, I'm on Instagram, Facebook, uh, TikTok, Twitter, LinkedIn. I mean, all of I'm on all the things.
So
So
I'm gonna spell Scharff for you. It's Scharff.
yes,
Yeah,
correct,
right. But
correct.
those are those podcast listeners. Remember, they're like, I don't know how to spell Scharff. They
Right.
don't know.
Well, yeah, well, because it's German. It's German, so
Right.
it's SCH, right? Yeah. Yeah. So, but yeah, you can find me, and listen, if you spell my name wrong, it'll still come up on the stuff too, right? You can Google's great about giving alternate things. But yeah, I think the most important thing is connection. And if we realize that the stories,
Are
the
important.
cultural narratives, our lived experience, my lived experience and your lived experience are different. And so I can't, I would do best if I wanted to be a service provider to ask, what is it that you need?
Mm-hmm.
And then honestly, provide referrals.
Which is different than how can I help?
Yeah, it's a lot different
Right.
because I maybe can't help. I was in Egypt, and it was when the Syrians refugees were flooding Western Europe, right, to get away from the civil war. And I was at a big mental health conference, and uh, that was very interesting because there was a whole I was boycotted because I'm Jewish, and I was like, well, you can come or you cannot come. I'm going to give you the same information. But I said we need Arabic speaking,
Hmm.
culturally competent providers,
Yes.
mental health practitioners in Europe. And they explained to me why they wouldn't do it. But it was interesting because I had made assumptions. I had made assumptions
Mhm.
that, of course, you're going to help, and these people have certain needs, and blah, blah,
That's
blah.
right.
And they're like, yeah, that's not how we roll here.
Yeah.
And so I was like, come from a lot of trauma, and I went to a trauma therapist who was very, very well regarded. And I said to her fairly early in the session, she was asking about my basic background and history. I said, I don't say Kaddish for my father's yard site.
Right. Okay.
Then, so a Jewish person knows what that means. And
I do. Yeah.
she had no idea. Right. And so I proceeded to spend the rest of the session.
Explain.
So obviously I never went back to her.
Right. Right.
So I I really understand that in whatever therapeutics we're providing, there is a cultural context that holds them. And you need someone who is fluid in that culture and understands that
And
culture. So
understand. Right.
I really understand rural people. I've lived in the country most of my life.
Hmm.
And that is a different set of needs. And like you were saying, being brought
Right.
up, in one of the boroughs, of New York City, like it's a very different
Yeah.
context. And so what I have tried to do, I formed, I guess it's almost 2 years ago now, a group called the Institute for Complementary and Indigenous Mental Health Research.
Mm.
And I don't do Indigenous mental health research. I'm not Indigenous. I observe things when I'm
Right.
invited, but
Right.
I don't do that research. But I wanted to include that in the organization because I wanted to hold open the door that was held
Yeah.
open for me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And so if someone is doing that kind of work, you have a place at my table with all the resources that I have access to.
That's
I am happy to share them with you. And if we want to be in conversation, because there's some similarities between what, Indigenous mental health workers are looking at and talking about, and what complementary
right.
therapeutics I'm looking at and talking about, there's some overlap there. We can have some great conversations, but I want to be supportive because, I belong to a group called the Society for Consciousness Studies. And when it was started, oh gosh, I don't know, 15 years ago now or something, but when it was started, it was a bunch of elderly white men, a lot of them like Nobel nominated types, Club of Budapest, Deepak Chopra, and
Yeah.
me. And I'm sitting, and I was talking to the professor who invited me to join, and I was fairly new in PhD and
Yeah.
wasn't, these guys are luminaries, right? And I was like, why do you want me? And he's like, because you're smart. I was like, well, thank you. I appreciate that. He's like, and because you bring a different perspective. In the first conference we had, I looked around and I was like, when I got the
Right. Right.
information, I was like, how come it's all white men except for me? It's like all old white men, And so I started bringing
Yeah. People.
women and
Yeah.
people of color, and they got it. They're like, yes. They're like, why is it old white men? Because when we were getting started, we're the ones who had access
That's it. Period.
to this. And now we want to hold the door open for people like you. Well, what is done for me, I mean, yes, it's part of it's being Jewish, but I also want to genuinely give that to others because I'd be nowhere without, these other people who went before me and said, yeah, we'll take a lady, we'll take a Jew, we'll take a, whatever, a black person, an indigenous person, not because they were forced to by some sort. They're like, no, I see potential in you.
That's right. I am so glad we had this opportunity, and I want to say Shabbat Shalom. And I
Oh,
know
thank you.
So, and we will visit again, and we have each other's contacts. For those of you people, thank you everyone for listening to Bridges Live with Dr. Paul and Constantine Scharff. So, I want you to replay this, Pete. When I always say this, please replay this and find out the things that you misheard. And if you misheard something, write it down and then ask that question. Because some people they just wash over something they heard and think they got in the context. And
Mm,
I think there's a lot of times that they miss this type of context because the key word that sticks out in my head that I want people to think about is connection.
yeah,
And
absolutely.
and then if you don't understand how to connect, where to connect, who to connect with, what to connect with, then there's so much part of that you're going to misunderstand. So thank you so much, Constantine.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
You have a great night.
You too.
Mm.